papers en la geotérmica en la región de Latinoamérica, especialmente Centroamérica. Vamos a dar inicio con la conferencia. Después de ella tendremos la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, donde nos acompañarán los conferencistas del bloque, el último del día de ayer. Vamos a dar inicio entonces con la conferencia.
Gudni, you can start.
Okay. So, buenos dias, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you in this event today, even though it's over this long distance through the internet. And unfortunately, I'm not able to see you. There may be somebody in the audience whom I know, so special hello to those of you. So I'm going to be talking about sustainable management of geothermal resources, specifically to look at the question whether geothermal resources can be utilized in a sustainable manner and what's involved in the management of geothermal resources in that case. The photo here on the front or at the beginning is taken in an Icelandic geothermal field about 150 years ago. This is within Reykjavik. It was at that time used for washing clothes mostly, as you can see. But today, 150 years later, it's still being utilized. But today it's used for space heating. So this is a long time and sort of hints at the sustainability of this utilization. This slide lists what I'm going to be covering. Some perhaps quickly, other aspects I'll go through in more detail. I'll talk a little bit about sustainable after a brief introduction about sustainable development in general. A little bit about renewability of geothermal resources because this is linked together. And then I will start to address the question, can geothermal resources contribute to sustainable development in different parts of the world? I'll spend some time talking about the time scale, what time scale we should be looking at, then what's involved in sort of, or what should be involved in sort of successful sustainable management, show you some long case histories which help us plan this for other geothermal systems, talk a little bit about sustainability modeling or assessment of geothermal resources, and then some research issues which are important, and then end by talking about sustainability goals and indicators and how these come together in what we call sustainability protocols. Now, as we all know, and that's why you are having this workshop, we know that increased utilization of geothermal resources can contribute to the world's sustainable development, which is something we all need to focus on, both as a long-term source of energy, but also because it's relatively environmentally friendly source of energy. And just to put things in a little bit of perspective, people have estimated that by 2050, geothermal electricity production could actually increase by about 500% from what it is today, and direct use even more, even by 5,000 or 1,000%. So the potential is great, but the use today is still relatively small. You know, the possibility of sustainable geothermal production of geothermal energy has actually been studied and discussed recently, but there have not in the literature, there do not exist sort of very relevant definitions. They have been missing, and people have really used the word sustainable because it's quite fashionable, used it quite a lot, and even I would claim they've not used it correctly, or they've really misused this term. So it's important that people are all on the same page and use sort of the same definitions. And it's also important to keep in mind that sustainable geothermal utilization doesn't only involve maintaining production from a given geothermal system for a long time, but this is actually what I'm going to be focusing on. But it also involves environmental and social issues, as well as economic or financial aspects. And it's very important, and I always like to emphasize that people don't mix up the terms sustainable and renewable, because if you go through the geothermal literature, you will find there is some confusion. And just to state it plainly and clearly, then the term renewable actually refers to the nature of a resource. It does not refer to how it is used, while the term sustainable does not refer to the nature of the resource, but it refers exactly to how it is used. So a resource is renewable or not renewable, and it can be used in a sustainable or non-sustainable manner. And I have a few slides, or 3 slides or so, on renewability, just to sort of explain a little bit better what I mean. And I can tell you, at least in sort of my part of the world, here in Iceland, where we, as you know, depend very heavily on geothermal resources. I know also in the US and in the international literature, people have been sort of arguing whether to classify geothermal resources as renewable or non-renewable. And in my mind, this really results from a need to classify a very complex resource like geothermal on the basis of a very simple classification system. Or in other words, the classification system is too simple. But what's really important, rather than arguing about the classification, is research aimed at improving how we understand, or our understanding of the nature of the geothermal systems, not some sort of a crude classification. That's not sort of the most important aspect. But having said that, then I'd like to emphasize that generally in the world and officially in most countries, geothermal resources are classified as renewable, and this is simply because they don't belong with the non-renewable resources like oil and coal and so on. But geothermal resources are in essence of sort of a double nature. They are complicated. So they are composed of sort of 2 components. First of all, a fully renewable energy flow component, or the energy flow through the system through heat convection and advection. And then there is all the vast stored energy in the rocks in the geothermal systems, which is enormous, but it's actually renewed very slowly on a long time scale through heat conduction. So geothermal resources are really composed of these 2 sort of components. And the renewal through heat conduction is very slow. So that does not fit, at least exactly, with the renewable classification, but it is still renewed, so it's not non-renewable. But the renewal through advection, convection, or fluid flow is much, much faster. But what's important to keep in mind is that this is extremely variable between different types of systems. And if we briefly look at some examples of the weight of the 2 components, then we can look at volcanic hydrothermal systems like we have in Iceland and in many of the Central American countries. Then the weight of the energy current, or the renewability, is quite large. This is the same also in other lower temperature systems, which are controlled by fracture circulation. But in other parts of the world where we have geothermal resources in sedimentary basins, in sedimentary geothermal systems, then the stored energy is actually, the weight of the stored energy is much greater. This also is in EGS systems. Okay, so this was just a few words on renewability to sort of set the background a little bit. But turning to sustainable development in general, the definition we still use today on what is sustainable development actually is by now more than 30 years old. It comes from the so-called Brundtland report from 1987, and this is a very, simple definition. It is in a way clear, but it's very general, and it says that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present or our needs today without compromising or damaging or reducing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So it's a very general definition. It has been applied to really all aspects of our existence and our development as humans. And it also has become quite fashionable. So people are, as I've already said, sometimes abuse it or misuse this just because it has this nice meaning behind it. And to simplify things, I think we can say that this is a twofold definition. It tells us that the utilization of the resources of the Earth, including geothermal resources, must be restrained or controlled so that we don't deplete them. And the other aspect is that the Earth's environment needs to be protected at all cost. And of course, when we're talking about sustainable development in general, then energy use, energy needs, and energy development is actually at the core of the issue of sustainable development. And geothermal energy certainly can play a role there. And this has been given increasing attention last decades, actually, not only the last decade, but some clear definitions, official policies have really been missing. And the term has been misused in the literature, as I've already mentioned. Now, turning more specifically to sustainability of geothermal utilization or geothermal sustainability, then at least the way I like to present it, then this involves sort of two main issues. First of all, the question, can geothermal resources be utilized in a sustainable manner? And I claim, and my colleagues who have been involved in looking at this, is that the really or quite long utilization histories we have available for some geothermal system, as well as modeling studies that are looking further into the future, confirm that geothermal resources can be utilized in a sustainable manner. But of course, the utilization has to be managed such that it is sustainable. And then the really big question is, what time scale should we base this on? What time scale should we use when we are assessing sustainability? And at least what is clear is that looking at this on sort of a geological time scale of tens or hundreds of thousands of years or even millions of years is really much too long compared with the time scale of our sort of endeavors or development and energy use, things like that. For example, we've only been using cars for 1 century. And this is something that's bound to change quite drastically, how we use cars and how we energize our cars in the future. And sort of based on some work that was done in Iceland almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago, there was a group of scientists that was working on this and debating this for quite a while. And we came up with a definition which I still believe is quite valid. Definition of this term, sustainable geothermal production. And it's important to keep in mind that this definition really only applies to the utilization or the extraction of the geothermal energy from the geothermal system, not the use on surface, but more focuses on the resource itself. And it says, as you can hopefully read on the screen, in Spanish, I guess, that for each geothermal system and actually each mode of production, there is a certain level of maximum energy production that if the production is below this level, then it is possible to maintain this production for a long time. And we proposed a period of 100 to 300 years. We'll look at that in more detail later. But if the production rate is greater than this E0, which is the sustainable level, it cannot be maintained for this length of time. If the production is below E0, we term it or name it sustainable production. But if it's greater, we call it or term it excessive production. And this is a simple sketch we presented at the time, showing what we mean. I don't know if you probably or hopefully can see my pointer here. This is a plot showing the energy production on the vertical scale and the time on the horizontal scale, time of 200 years. And there is this sustainable level, E0, you can see marked up here. And if the production is below or almost equal to the sustainable level, it can be maintained over this long period. But if it's greater, that is, if it's excessive, it cannot be maintained and will sort of automatically decline below the sustainable level. And this is based on worldwide experience of utilizing many geothermal systems for a long time, not perhaps for 200 years, but 50, 60, 70, 80 years in some cases. Now, coming to the time scale, which was in a way the most difficult thing to come up with a suggestion. The time scale is much longer, as you can see. It's much longer than the time scale of conventional economic or feasibility assessment. In such assessment, people often look at 25 to 30 years. And we can also note that actually economic assessments are actually or have a problem seeing so far into the future. But it's also shorter than historical timescales, which are of the order of a few thousand years, or geologically relevant timescales, which are much greater than tens of thousands of years, because it really doesn't make any sense to be looking 1,000 years into the future. We have no idea or no way to predict at what stage or development mankind will be at that time. So it doesn't really make sense to look very far into the future, but we need to look much further than conventional feasibility assessments. But one thing also is that if we had decided to look at a timescale of 1 million years, maybe the age of the geothermal systems, then the sustainable production level would have been very low. It would only have been the natural flow through the systems. But this way, the sustainable level is much greater and and makes much more sense. I can tell you, and as I do in this slide, that initially in the next few years after we presented this was sort of received with skepticism, and generally because people thought this time frame was much too long. just because they were used to looking at 25, 30 years, something like that. And this was mainly from the economic viewpoint. But I think by now that lots of people, or a large part of the geothermal community, has really accepted some sort of view like this, or some sort of timescale like this. But some countries where this is being sort of, or attempts are being made to apply this definition, are looking still at shorter timescales, 100 years maybe. And so this is something that maybe you can discuss during your workshop. What do you think is the right timescale? I mentioned 100 years there because in New Zealand, I don't know exactly how, but in New Zealand, they have been at least proposing to look for 100 years, which we sort of consider to be the minimum timescale. Another thing is very important to keep in mind, which people often misunderstand, is that if you look at this and define this for, let's say, 200 years, then the geothermal resources will not have been depleted or emptied in any way after 200 years. Probably we cannot maintain the same level of production after 200 years, but production can still be continued, perhaps at a lower rate through different technologies and so on. And of course, we expect or hope for considerable advances in geothermal technology over the next few hundred years. I'll skip the next point, it's not important here. But this sustainable production level, which we call E0, it is important to keep in mind that it's actually difficult to estimate this. The only way to do it accurately is by setting up models, numerical models, or other types of models of the geothermal system. But to be able to do that accurately, we need quite a lot of good data on the geothermal system. And at the initial stage of utilization, or initial step, it's very difficult to know or estimate this E0. But it's also important to keep in mind that we can, or we hope that, our sort of technology will continue to increase, or improve, like I've already mentioned. And we can expect the sustainable level for certain geothermal systems to actually increase with increasing knowledge of the geothermal systems through exploration, through drilling, through monitoring, etc. But also we expect it to increase through technological advances in exploration, in drilling, such as deeper drilling to extract the energy at greater depth, reinjection, improved reinjection technology, improved utilization, improved efficiency, generation technology, and so on. So the sustainable production level E0, for which we may estimate for a certain geothermal system, perhaps after a few decades, it may have actually gone up and instead of staying stable or even going down. And here is, for example, here is one example. That's the sort of promise we see in drilling deeper into volcanic geothermal systems, even extracting thermal energy from magma. And this is a well that was drilled in the north of Iceland, actually into magma a few years ago, only at 2,200 meter depth, but it turned out to be extremely powerful, capable of producing 36 megawatts of electricity, but it turned out to be really too powerful for people to control it. So it sort of, the casings and the wellhead failed. So it's not in use today. But there is big promise there in increased energy extraction from these systems. But again, I want to emphasize that this definition or sustainable geothermal utilization does not only involve maintaining production from each geothermal system, like I've been sort of emphasizing, and not only preserving the environment. Some people may look at it like that sustainable geothermal utilization mainly focuses on environmental issues, but it really should be, in addition to maintaining production from each geothermal system, it's a sort of combined economical, social, and environmental development. And that's why some people have raised the question, and I'll show you an example of that a little later, whether production can actually be excessive for a period if it's outweighed by social or improved social economic conditions for local populations. In other words, is it okay to use a geothermal system excessively for a while, for some decades, and with great benefit to the local population, but then after some decades you may have to reduce the production and find new geothermal resources or other sources of energy when economic and social conditions have improved. Now, I just want to mention what are sort of the, in my mind and my colleagues, what's perhaps sort of the most important aspects of the management of geothermal resources when we're managing them or trying to manage them for these long time scales we're looking at. 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. And there are a few things, basically three things, which I always like to emphasize. First of all, it's very accurate, comprehensive monitoring of how the system responds to production, how the pressure in the system changes, how temperature, energy content, chemistry, etc. So it's extremely important to monitor these aspects as carefully as possible. In the past, I think people did not realize this, and they didn't know what was happening in the geothermal systems during utilization. But I think today, in most cases, people are already placing a lot of emphasis on this. And the examples I know, for example, in Central America, in those geothermal fields, there is great emphasis on this monitoring. Reinjection, I think, is a key element of sustainable long-term utilization to help maintain the reservoir pressure. Using models to understand the geothermal systems and predict into the future is a key tool in sustainable management. And I also think people in most cases realize that. And what this all sort of leads to, or the sort of basis of this, is that the past is really the key to the future. That is, the monitoring helps us set up the models, which then are used to calculate predictions into the future. Now, there are actually, or we can sort of imagine more or a few different modes of geothermal utilization, not only utilization, constant utilization through the whole time period, just at or below the sustainable level. This is not a realistic option because we don't know what the sustainable limit is at the beginning. Then another option is to go through sort of a stepwise development or stepwise increase in production, which starts out well below the sustainable limit, but then sort of approaches the sustainable limit in steps. Then the question is, can we look at, and this is, I should emphasize, this is really debatable, but should we look at periods of excessive production, that is production greater than the sustainable limit, perhaps for 30 years, and then followed by breaks, and then starting again, sort of cyclic production? Could this be sort of a possible mode, sustainable mode? yeah, and some ways we can look at it like that. And we have seen in geothermal systems and through modeling that, and I'll show you some examples of that later, is that geothermal systems during such breaks, they actually recover quite quickly in terms of pressure, especially, and also in terms of energy content. But this would require some other source of energy, hopefully geothermal or other renewable source of energy during the breaks when the system is allowed to recover. Then there is a sort of a fourth option, which I'm not really going to dwell on. This simple figure here is actually supposed to demonstrate or explain this idea of stepwise development. Actually, many geothermal systems have been developed in this way, that people start out with a modest, relatively small step, and then they increase the production in steps after a period of a few years. And the benefit of this is that during the first 1 or 2 steps, we actually can collect so much data on the geothermal system that we can estimate, after 1 or 2 steps, we can actually estimate the sustainable limit, which was not possible in the beginning. And this also benefit of this is that this provides revenues or income for the company or that is developing the geothermal resource. This simple sketch also shows this, what we expect the sustainable limit, or this E0, how we expect it to increase with time because of improved mode of production after technological advances like deeper drilling and things like that. And in this way, we also should completely avoid overexploitation. So this is the sort of ideal way of developing geothermal system in a sustainable manner. This sketch shows all 4 different modes sort of plotted on one graph. I hope you can see it clearly. You see the green stepwise development in green. But what I wanted to point out specifically is this cyclic production, which is excessive, well above the sustainable limit for a period, as shown here, for 30 years or maybe longer, but then with breaks in between. This is another way of sort of visualizing this. Now, but what's really extremely important for us here is to really learn from the experience of utilizing many geothermal systems, these long case histories which we have available. And these, as I've already said, these long case histories, they actually demonstrate that we can utilize geothermal system for a very long time. And in some cases, systems find such sort of a semi-equilibrium, or in other cases, the changes are so small that, or so slow, that they are manageable within this time frame we're looking at, and especially when we apply re-injection. And the point is, we can use modeling studies to extend these long case histories to maybe 1, 2, or 3 centuries. And here is a list of just some examples of quite long case histories. The longest ones are actually the geysers in California, Lardarello in Italy, which are 60, 70 years. Then we have some examples here in Iceland, in Hungary, which are even longer. Wairaki in New Zealand has a very long case history of 60 years. So we have some case histories, and there is data available on these systems which we can learn a lot from. I have a few slides here in the continuation with some samples. I'm going to go quite rapidly through these. This is actually data from the Lardarello field in Italy. The blue dots show the pressure changes in the geothermal reservoir from actually 1940s, and show also a model calculations of the pressure changes. So this is a quite long history which can be used to make very accurate predictions into the future. Same is for the Wairaki field in New Zealand, and this figure or this slide shows the same. The pressure changes here in the lower right corner with the calculated pressure changes. And then we are here in El Salvador. This is the production and pressure history of the Awas Japan field in El Salvador. You see the pressure is in the upper half of the figure, how it declined during the first years of development because of increasing production. But then it was, this is relatively old, but there should exist more recent data, show this sort of stabilization of the pressure over a very long time. But we also have examples of of non-sustainable or excessive production. An example I always like to show is the geysers in California, which is a very or dramatically large geothermal operation. In the 1980s, late 1980s, there were power plants with a cumulative production capacity of 2,000 megawatts in the field. This was actually much too great to be maintainable or even sustainable. And this figure shows how the production peaked in the late 1980s, and then it just has declined very rapidly since then. And there was no way of sort of stopping this decline, even with more drilling or however people tried. The only way that could sort of slow this down was a re-injection, which increased quite a lot during this time period. You can see the lower half of the figure shows the injection. Another example, I'm going to skip this, it's maybe not so relevant in Central America. This is the Paris Basin. It's a very good example of long-term utilization of a sedimentary geothermal resource. It has been utilized now for about 60 years, quite successfully. But how do we estimate this E0? I've already said, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this slide, this is simply done by modeling, through predictions on pressure and energy changes. And the predictions must, of course, be within acceptable limits. But it's very difficult to, as I've already said, to estimate E0 for green fields or fields with limited production or limited data or limited information. But I have some examples of predictions calculated by different types of models, showing how we can, if we have sufficient data, how we can predict into the future. This is an example for predictions of the reservoir pressure in a geothermal field in Beijing, in China, in the capital of China. This is a prediction calculated up to the year 2160, which actually shows that the system can continue to be utilized, especially if re-injection is applied. We also have such predictions calculated for El Salvador. This is an example of pressure predictions, reservoir pressure predictions for Awas Japan, calculated for a 100-year utilization period. These are predictions calculated for the Wairaki field in New Zealand. The upper figure here actually shows how the pressure in the system recovers if production is stopped in 2053, 100 years after utilization started. according to the model they have developed, the pressure will recover very quickly within 10 years or so. But what's maybe notable is that the temperature changes, they actually will recover more slowly. So this is just some simple, and I'm sorry how quickly I have to go through this, but some examples of predictions calculated over this long period of 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, especially intended for this purpose of studying the possibility of utilizing a geothermal system in a sustainable manner. Next slide actually lists some research issues. This is perhaps not so relevant in this context, but there is still lots of research that needs to be done. For example, on, we have a geothermal system we're utilizing for a very long time, for 100 years. The question is, how far reaching are the effects of production? How far does the pressure travel or have an effect, and how far does the cooling because of injection travel? This question of how effectively systems recover, how reliable are these predictions, and what information, sort of in addition to what people are already collecting, is really necessary to be able to predict so far into the future. Okay, I'm almost coming to the end of my presentation. I hope I'm still within my time limit. What I want to end this just by discussing a little bit how people see or how it is possible to sort of take this one step further. That's not only to look at whether the geothermal systems can be utilized such a long time or not, and the question is whether this can't be done through by developing some sort of sustainability policy. This can be on a case-by-case level for different geothermal systems, on the level of different geothermal systems, but this can also be on a country-wide level. And people have, I think we can say in the last 10 years or so, been looking at the possibility of doing this somehow, and the way people are proposing this is actually the same way it is done for sort of other aspects of energy use or other aspects of mankind's existence, really. And that this involves setting up some sorts of goals, or we can call them sustainability goals, which are some sort of goals we aim to meet, and they should really incorporate both the resource, economics, environmental aspects, and social aspects. And then people need to develop some sort of what we call indicators proposed on basis of the goals, which are then used to measure how sustainable the operation is towards the different types of goals, or how is the progress towards with time towards sustainability. And together, such sustainability goals and indicators, this is commonly called geothermal sustainability assessment protocol. So the goals and the indicators together, and we abbreviate this GSAP. Just to show you an example, we have for quite some period been discussing this a little bit in Iceland, and here is a list of what some suggested goals, what they incorporate in our suggestions, without going into any details. The resource management, renewability of the resource, etc., constitute 2 goals. That is how we use the resource. Then we have the efficiency of the energy generation. Research is an important part of sustainability, innovation, development, environmental impact, social aspects, energy security and accessibility, availability, all that. the economic and financial aspects. And what we claim is very important is sharing of knowledge. This is generally something that's generally done within quite a lot within the geothermal industry. It's of course not common in other industries, but I think people in the geothermal industry have learned that sharing the knowledge, sharing the information they collect helps everybody, including themselves. Okay. The question is, have there many sustainability assessment protocols been developed? This may just reflect my limited knowledge, but to my mind, this has been rather limited so far. This is also the idea, or the concept is quite young. There was a PhD project by a PhD student here in Iceland who completed that a few years ago. Her name is Ruth Shortall. She wrote a comprehensive thesis and papers on proposing this methodology and proposed a set of indicators. This was linked with at least some sort of trying this out or connecting this with geothermal utilization in New Zealand, Iceland, and in Kenya, actually. Then I can mention that the main Icelandic power companies, there are 3 main power companies, and actually the National Energy Authority of Iceland, they have developed a protocol which is actually based on a comparable protocol for hydropower. And I think this has a serious drawback because it doesn't really look enough or consider the resource enough. Then I'd like to mention a relatively simple but interesting protocol developed by LAHEO in El Salvador. But the question is, I'm not sure whether, and I don't have the most recent information, whether such protocols have been developed in New Zealand, the US. I don't think they have been developed in the US. I know people are looking at this in Kenya, and has this been looked at in other parts of Central America? Maybe we can discuss this in the following Q&A session. So this concludes my presentation. This is just a brief summary or conclusion. Just want to iterate again that this proposed timescale of 100 to 300 years. The sustainable potential is E0 is actually either controlled by pressure decline or by the energy content of the system. This depends on the nature of the system. There are these quite a few very long geothermal case histories that provide very important data for sustainability and renewability research. And then finally, I'd like to mention that the most ideal way of utilizing geothermal resource in a sustainable manner is through some sort of stepwise increase in production or stepwise development. Okay, so I'm done. So thank you very much for listening to me and giving me the opportunity to present my ideas. And I will be around for a while and ready to take part in discussions and answer questions if any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gudni. We will proceed with the Q&A session.
Vamos a pasar a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Le pedimos al señor César Rosales, Fernando Molina y Manuel Monterrosa que nos acompañen en la tarima para que podamos pasar a la parte de preguntas y respuestas. La moderadora en este caso será Paola Flores de IEEE Women in Engineering. Adelante, Paola, y los conferencistas.
The first question is, how can we avoid resource exploitation, but instead of exploiting the resources, to protect it? So one of the panelists is answering the question. The idea is to exchange points of view. Guli did an excellent presentation, and basically it summarizes everything we have been discussing. I want to be very punctual on some aspects. First of all, how to increase generation. First of all, we have to do a resource assessment. How much it's possible, how much is likely, how much is proven that we can extract. For this, we have enough studies where you can do the calculation starting from a conceptual model that must be previously established, because a conceptual model can be done with one single visit. From there, it can be as simple as a geologist going to a volcano and define if there could be a resource there and do an assessment, and then determine how much could I have from this resource. Then comes the drilling, assessment, and the units. Like this is how we can do the increase. If we do the step-by-step approach, as Gani mentioned, the step-wise approach, this works. This is what I think is the best to increase. And if you want to be more aggressive, then you can have a bigger plan, do massive perforation, massive drilling, which the risks it implies. Or you can drill in different zones or in known areas. The problem would be financial as usual because risks. If we drill in a small area where it has been, in many cases, a problem in some geothermal fields, this area tends to get overexploited, and many think or misunderstand it, saying, the reservoir is no good, but you just have 1 square kilometer. You have to expand more to verify if there's more potential in other zones. As we expand, we get more generation increase in a sustainable manner. If we focus in a square kilometer or we put 100 mega, the decline would be too intense, and they would say, the field doesn't work. But wait a moment, let's keep on exploring. That's why we've recommended a spokesperson that we must continue exploring new zones in order to increase more and more step by step. Of course, we need to keep on drilling. This becomes financial problems that I mentioned yesterday. And what to do? I mean, we have to keep on drilling, right? There's no way around it. We have to keep our wells. Now, talking about the social environmental aspects, well, geothermal, it's friendly for the environment. It has complications, yes, as any other human activity. The mere fact of being here together, we're affecting the environment because this was a forest, this was a coffee forest, and this built, and we're affecting the environment. Yes, any human activity affects the environment. The thing is how we can harmonize human development with the environment and the social aspect as well. There are countries like Iceland, 300,000 inhabitants, 300,000 square kilometers. How much is the population compared to our country? That in 1900 kilometers were 6 million inhabitants. So here people are around us. Just go to my country. We have people everywhere. So the social part here is critical, different from Iceland. Of course, here we need to guard this. We need to take into account the social aspect. And this is true. We can harmonize. It has costs. Yes, of course, everything bears cost. And it's not cheap, geothermal energy. Yes, how expensive? That's a challenge. It's profitable. Geothermal energy is profitable if we know how to manage it. So I defend geothermal energy. I know it's profitable and it's sustainable. Thank you. Now, Engineer Rosales, Engineer Molina, the floor is yours. Well, I just wanted to say that I agree on everything mentioned by my colleagues. I just want to give an approach, a scope, a change of paradigm. We always think that the source is measured in square meters and that to grow we need to explore more kilometers or less kilometers in our surface. Iceland, you gave us, Gudni, a very good paradigm that we need to consider. It's not about the surface only. What about what's below it? You see a slide where you were doing 220 meters and you find 420 degrees with a well of 35 megawatts. The average on the surface that we have in Latin America, we're talking about wells of 3 to 10 megawatts. Also in Mexico, we've done this. What happens if we drill deeper? We already have a well of 25 megawatts. That could be a new growth factor. However, we need to solve some technical issues. And when having more temperature, there's more delays, segmentations must be different, the type of material must be different. In Mexico, we are already changing wells for this type of zones with pipelines or chromed pipes. So there's a benefit cost that's pretty good. So this is basically what I wanted to add to what you mentioned. That's all. Thank you. Good morning. To achieve sustainability, first of all, as I said yesterday, first we need to know the system, the geothermal system. Yeah, we need to know the geothermal system, as I said. This will guarantee much more to have this clarity of our drilling objectives are headed towards. Knowing our hydropower systems, we could do better developments and then we can do better monitoring. At the beginning of the year, we were drilling in Borinque, and in Borinque, we know, as I mentioned yesterday, that geology is different to the rest of the country's one. We were preparing it, and the wells were going deeper, and they told me that the geology responsible said that we should change the design of the well. We changed the inclination of the well, and we dig deeper, meaning drilling deeper to complement what you were saying. Because we know geology, we know if it's very well delimited regarding the thermal anomaly, and we know where heat is. We went down a few meters below, we went up to 1200 meters, and we had a well of 14 megawatts. So we did it. If we know the system, we can make decisions that are sound and safer. There's risk, yes. If you drill deeper, you're endangering your drilling. You can only have maybe the upward system, but in this case that we're developing a new field, then we first need to open up the field. We need to try, but being very careful. But we need to grow step by step. You need to do modeling. You need to go by the safest modeling. You bet on the best conditions. So you do this model for the plant. In the case of yesterday, there was 57 megawatts. When you do a modeling, you also set a time and temperature. But this temperature is what gives you more security, the smaller area. So you are born, I mean, you get married, sorry, with this model. And then you give it time to exploit it, to see its behavior on its source. And depending on how the source behaves, then you can decide to exploit it more and more. Today we have smaller developments with units of 25. All of these things facilitate because technology has improved. So it's easier in order to develop fields and to really have a better useful life. I'm repeating the question. We're repeating the question. What should be the strategies to increase power and electric generation for resources not to be exploited, but to take full advantage of them and to protect them as well? Did you get the question? The question is, what are the
Mr. Axelson, did you hear the question?
Yeah, sorry, I heard it. I wasn't clear whether it was aimed at me or somebody else in the panel. So if you want me to answer the question, can you please repeat it?
Since we have the experts from Costa Rica, Mexico, and Iceland, we would like to ask another question. Can you please present a case study where constant monitoring and specific variables that we discussed through the whole workshop allow us to optimize some of the processes? In the case of Ahuachapán, we are monitoring this as of the production started in 75, and we did it priorly to the measurement in wells in 1995 to 1997 in Ahuachapán. We show an automated measurement system in wells, electronic wells with a PLC and industrial pressure meters, communication, heart, and the Marta transmission. So in Ahuachapán, we have a real-time record of all the different well parameters of most of them. Pressure of reservoirs, as well as separation pressure, and also the flows, vapor flows and steam flows. There's some wells that are connected by radio frequency. So we have all the information of wells with a level of detail which is pretty high. I'm not sure how much time you take samples, but maybe 5-10 minutes per data. In Berlin, we have also a separator control measurement. So the separators keep a level. So basically they download the system and field monitoring as well, production, reinjection. So all this information goes to a database. So we can see the behavior of the wells, and we do a report, a daily report that we distribute to all the involved persons in the field management in order to know what the field operation all about, as well as the plant. And like this, we take the corrective measures that are necessary, and then we tackle the issues directly, we analyze it, and we take preventive actions to monitor the plant, the power of the plant. In our case, is 95% above. Perfect, thank you. Engineer Rosales, please, Mexico. As said, in the most difficult case was this project. Despite of having all the variables measured, we didn't really know what was happening. And the research with tracers as well as other procedures of studies and research, we met and saw that there was water, more mass, incoming mass of than the balance. That's why I mentioned that we started having evaporation lagoons and heated injection and field with this type of changes reached a new stability, and it was not the generation we thought it was going to have. So for sure with what our Iceland presenter said what's going to happen. There's going to be a moment where the pressure and temperature recover once again. We possibly will reach a new stability as presented by our island colleague, but it's not a factor that happens overnight. You have to wait. Likewise, the case I brought yesterday, I thought it was pretty representative. Pilas, where we took measures to have a constant monitoring on field, take the measures in the precise moment in order not to have temperature drops, even though we did have drastic pressure and temperature drops, but we took measurements in the right moment. We were able then to recover pressure and stabilize temperature. And now we hope that with these policies, we can still monitor the field and to recover it even further. But in Costa Rica was the case that I presented in pilots of re-injection that was reaching productive wells. Perfect, thank you very much. Now we Island, Dr.
Sorry, there are some interruptions in. I did not hear what you said.
Yes, the question is, could you present a case where continuous monitoring and a specific variables allow you to optimize a process? If you have an example or a case study of optimization of the process.
Well, I perhaps don't have a very clear case study where this has been done on purpose right from the beginning. But the way where people have really been doing this, trying to optimize, is through models, by setting up accurate, good models of geothermal systems, and then trying to optimize based on different criteria or different goals. And one of these, of course, can be this can be the long-term sustainable utilization. But I would just like to emphasize that I agree, when I've been able to see that through my presentations, that I agree with at least what I've understood of what the panelists have been saying. The key to sustainable management or sustainable utilization is, number one, to collect as much information as possible, both, the exploration and other research and drilling and through drilling and so on, but also, which is really the key, is to do these measurements, this monitoring that the panelists were mentioning during utilization, from the beginning of utilization. And because based on this, we acquire more understanding and can set up these models to do calculations into the future and to optimize the utilization in that sense. And if I can also maybe add a little bit to what some of the panelists mentioned, is that, as I already mentioned also, is that we here in Iceland, we at this moment are focusing a little bit on sort of expanding the resource to greater depth instead of expanding it so much horizontally, expanding it to greater depth by drilling, deeper. And I think this eventually will work. This is what we have seen through the history of the geothermal industry. If you go back 70 years, people were drilling relatively shallow wells. Now it's easy for us to drill down to 3 kilometers. And we have demonstrated that we can drill down to 4 or 5 kilometers. But this requires, lots of technological advances in terms of utilizing the fluid, in terms of materials for the casings and wellheads, etc. And another aspect which is the key is whether we have or whether we are able to sort of target good enough permeability down there, whether there is enough fluid down at, let's say, 5 kilometers. That is still remains to be answered, but we foresee that, there may be two possible ways of utilizing resources down there. One is by producing fluid if there is enough fluid, but another way would be to inject or use these wells as re-injection wells, re-inject the fluid down to this great depth where it is heated up to quite high temperatures and then produce it perhaps at shallower levels. Otherwise, I agree with what the other or what the panelists have said. It's along the lines I've been discussing or I was discussing in my presentations. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting perspective, Dr. Axelsen. Okay, now we've reached 20 minutes. I would like to know if there's any other questions from the audience. We have a question from the audience. First of all, a comment and then a question. The comment is that we talked about resource sustainability. I think Gudni mentioned it as sustainability of the utilization of your thermal resources. I think that's different. There's a difference there. Then we talked that in the future, in Gudni's presentation, and I think also Manuel mentioned the inclusion of social and environmental aspects. If we think that the geothermal reservoir is going to be used for utilization or exploitation, we use more the term exploitation. The surface, we also have the geothermal reservoir that feeds hydropower sources like geysers that represent lives, means of lives. Also, this could promote tourism and they represent a cultural heritage. Maybe not in our countries, but in South America, for instance, it represents a valuable portion for indigenous people, for instance. So when we incorporate the environmental variables into sustainability coming from what I can exchange, natural capitals, economic capitals, change this to a stronger sustainability where I must also preserve this others. The specific question is, how limiting is the use of geothermal potential for socio-environmental inclusion? The question is for the three Spanish panelists. Okay, the question is that you have a concern that geothermal manifestations in surface generate tourism and they might be exploited if we harm the source. It's interesting. There's a concern, especially when you are in a community and tourism is an attraction because there are some geothermal sources there or spring waters. If it's only through rock, through fluids, when we could put a structure in the surface, there's other heat, water sources or vapor, steams that warms up meteoric waters. This water generates thermal manifestations. This thermal manifestation, it's there regardless of the reservoir, meaning we go there, we exploit the reservoir. In the case of Costa Rica, we still have not seen that this has been affected. Nothing of this has been affected, but it increases tourism more likely. It's an attraction. A classic case is Pailas, which is our national park. If we would harm Pailas, this will be shut down, this park. Not only the project, but all the projects will be shut down. In our case, nothing has happened, but it's very well defined that deep geothermal system with a superficial or shallow geothermal manifestations. The other part that we have in Costa Rica is that near Miravalles, there's a town called Bagasas. There's a problem of water contamination. Water contamination, it's natural because it's close to the volcanic areas. Many times the same volcanic rock has its contaminants. So at a specific point of time, there was a study made, and we blame the development of the project to that contamination. This town is 20 kilometers away. It was interesting to see that the water of the project, drinking water, was not contaminated. What was contaminated was the other water that was there in that source after many investigations, research, because at the end of the day, they come and they blame you for contamination. They don't give you the benefit of the doubt. So you must prove that you're not guilty. Then everything was clarified. We saw that this was natural contamination of those water sources. It was not related to the project because when you do the injection well or exploitation, they are sealed up to certain profundity underneath that capacity in order for them not to have any interaction with the superficial water sources. Thank you. I understand your concern. In fact, all the geothermal plants in Latin America have had this issue. Sometimes they have resistance. Society has this resistance thinking that we are harming the environment. Mexico's fuel, it's a great example. Who knows the azufres won't let me lie. When it started, it was an area, it was forest, there was nothing there. Now it's a touristic center and it's very nice. Even a president said that whoever wants to release stress, go there. It has a lagoon, it has hydrothermal sources, and the inhabitants that back then existed took advantage of that infrastructure and they generated a lot of wealth. There's beautiful cabins, but for the case of the spring waters, they resisted. So we did monitoring throughout the existing water sources for them to approve and agree with the analysis of a third one where there's no contamination. So the water here, but most exists in the zone, in the surface, there's not much water. So it's now the other way around. Since we don't have thermal sources, there are superficial waters that are ready. We're creating them ourselves. The topic is that last year there is a heat pump to show this, to demonstrate this. It meant drilling 2 meters on the surface to put in some water, and the water has temperatures of 25 degrees, which are being used through a heat pump with German technology in order to cool areas with heat or cold. It's the first one in Latin America. We want to show that we can do swimming pools too, and we have a project of also using geothermal waters to create an artificial lake in which they can also have source of income. The landowners are convinced after many years of working with them that yes, there has been more and more development. It's good, and there's benefits. It brings benefits than when they consider it at first. And now the permits for exploitation to have new wells are very simple. In the case of Cerro Peto, mentioned by Victor, as Victor said, we had a demand, a suit, because the field was contaminated. So they did a lot of expert work. They realized that contamination came from another source. So now all this is changing. Society is changing. They're accepting more of this. Interesting question. I apologize again if I say something that people don't like to hear. I think we should be very specific. And if the truth hurts, well, that's it. It's better to hear the truth now than later. I clarify this because sometimes we're kind of blunt. You didn't disguise them much. So I think that I've been working in this sector for 30 years or more. I think it's cause and effect. If we affect a reservoir, there's going to be an effect. This effect cannot be avoided. What we can is to observe, measure, and assess. Or remediation. Yeah, remediation. There are many things that satanize geothermal because they usually blame geothermal. They all blame it on them because they don't know the subsoil. We don't know. So logically, the community or the external community, they don't know. They are ignorant. Sometimes they are blaming geothermal for anything that takes place. So there are some effects. Let me frame this. There's several things taking place, simple ones, which don't mean they're not important. For instance, there might be some earthquakes because of reinjection, but micro, mini, doesn't mean that there are earthquakes. In base in Europe for a drilling project, there was an earthquake when we were drilling, and they said that the perforation generated the earthquake. This is part of the sublimation. Of course, there's micro earthquakes, though to what trigger, and the geophysics need to define if this amount of energy is enough to generate an earthquake. That's not my competency. Geophysicals can analyze this. It's catastrophic if that's the case. Another effect is cultural effects. In New Zealand, Maori community, which is the indigenous people, they have sacred places there. Imagine that geothermal are sacred places, and we're attempting against the essence of human beings. Maori, there are projects that are not developed in New Zealand because there are issues of inhabitants there previous to the English ones that were in New Zealand. So these are problems because we have even war zone, and we all know this. So we keep on going down. Tourism. If there's a water spring and I put tourism there, that might reduce. If this is the tourist attraction, we're going to get complicated. we're going to use symbiosis there, meaning the good friend, the good neighbor. Doing like a blue lagoon, for instance. In Iceland, Blue Lagoon, it's a beautiful lagoon of geothermal water. Guni maybe can mention this. So that's symbiosis, but it's gonna affect in Japan. A lot of geothermal fields are not developed because they're touristic zones, and in Japan, the medicine baths, geothermal medicine baths are precious. A lot of development is not done due to this. Then we go to another level, less complicated level, the use of water. We re-inject geothermal water with high mineralization. We monitor, but what about we are applying knowledge to guarantee to the population that there's no potential problems. So we cannot say 100% we are not going to make this happen. If somebody tells 100%, I would say, I would pray because it's God. So that can be done. We are simple mortals. We need to analyze information. We need to apply engineering techniques, and we give an assessment. In Berlin, for instance, there was a problem with reinjection, saying that it was affected water sources, drinking water, which is a problem too. That's life. And we analyzed this and we discovered that it's not the case. I think we are pretty much involved in this, but I can't say if in 15 years this is going to come to light, if it's going to be a problem. I can say we're monitoring, analyzing geology-wise, but there is an effect, but it's manageable for me. That's why I classified earthquake. The city was destroyed. That's very complicated. The rest, I think, it's manageable. If there is the political will of governments, of institutions to respect and support geothermal and not make it an evil, not making the evil, it's not evil. It just requires institutional support for sustainable development to work and not to limit ourselves and do maneuvers that are going to risk nature. So if we are in agreement that there are things we shouldn't do, and institutions support us, the geothermal, it's a very good renewable resource. I think that would be fabulous, as in Iceland. Iceland, they have a very good development as well as in other countries around the world. I think in this aspect, we could do it very well. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. We have a break. Thank you very much. And we are finalizing the question in the Q&A session. Thank you very much. I think that's break time. And I think that's it, Mr. Axelson. It was nice to meeting you. And thank you so much for your attention. Bye.
Okay, thank you.